Philosophical Jew. Today's topic is going to be free will. The question, if you haven't guessed it already, is do we have any free will? Another question we're going to discuss is what is the Jewish take on free will, and does Judaism even allow for the possibility of determinism? So let's set the stage. As you may find out from a Google search, and I tested this in a private browser with a VPN to different locations to see what happens when you search up on YouTube free will, just free will. Nothing else, like do we have free will? Not like do we really have free will? Nothing like that. I just put in the words free will. My experience, at least, is that when you type that up, you are inundated. You are given a bunch of deterministic viewpoints on the topic. I'm not going to just be attacking determinism. That's not the goal of this episode, but I felt like there is something lacking in a voice for freedom of the will. The question about the reality of free will has been in the philosophical sphere for centuries. For the Jewish crowd among us, it goes back to before Maimonides. It goes back to the Talmud. The sages disputed it there, and we have a long, long history of people debating this topic. It seems like nowadays this topic has gained more traction in the scientific community and in the community online, especially due to Sam Harris's book Free Will. And Robert Sapolsky now has been an advocate for determinism as well. He also wrote a book called Determined, and he has been the newest advocate of determinism. So the scientific data does seem to point to an increasingly large level of determinism in our decision-making. This has caused many philosophers, neuroscientists, psychologists, and even physicists to adopt a deterministic worldview. Is this a plausible conclusion? Is there still a reason to believe in free will, despite all the data that seems to point otherwise? Or has it been verifiably proven that we live in a deterministic universe? Before we begin, let's define terms. What is determinism? Britannica defines determinism as the view that all events in the universe, including human actions, are causally inevitable and cannot be otherwise. In other words, there is no free will, no matter which way you slice the thought pattern pie. Everything we want to do, according to this definition, is simply a combination of environmental, genetic, or experiential causes. Nothing that you do is up to you. No matter how you define free will, it would be a sleight of hand or an illusion. Regardless, since free will is a legitimate philosophical viewpoint as well, it's important to define exactly what free will is. I'm actually going to use a colloquial definition just because I prefer it, honestly. So free will, the best way I understand it, and the best way I understand how most people actually do think of it, is the ability to have acted differently than we had in a certain situation if we would wind back the clock to that exact moment. Meaning I did choose A, but I could have chosen B. That's it. That's what we believe free will is. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's take a step back very quickly just to put things in perspective. What people seem to get stuck on in this conversation is the free versus the determined part. And obviously for good reason. That does seem to be the crux of what we're discussing. But I'd like to actually say that what we're really discussing is the will. Is our will determined? Is our capacity to make a choice determined, or is it free? You'll see why this makes a difference, I think, as we go along. But for now, just keep that in mind. And without further ado, let's begin our case for determinism. I choose to start with determinism because I think that it's important to set the background, the backdrop of what we're working with, and sort of make us think about the other side of the equation for a moment. Not that I'm saying that I am a free will advocate. Do not want to make that claim. As we go along, we'll see that there are other ways to look at this besides for a binary. So let's begin with determinism. To portray what determinism looks like, I'm actually going to resort to the Batman and the Joker. You might think that that has nothing to do with free will and determinism, but hear me out. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from this. When we think of Batman's ultimate enemy, I would bet that 98% of people would say that Batman's ultimate enemy is the Joker. There's a good reason for this. You know, the Batman represents justice and order, and the Joker represents chaos and evil. Throughout almost every single rendition of a Batman movie that I have seen, in which the Joker is a part of, the Joker always views Batman and himself as two sides of the same coin. Batman is always in Joker's mind, and even perhaps to us, the audience, one bad day away from becoming just as insane as Joker, if not more. Why is that? And what does that have to do with free will and determinism? To answer this, I would like to point to a scene from the 2004 animated The Batman series. In this scene, Batman is entering the mind of Joker, literally, not figuratively, like he's not psychoanalyzing him. He's literally using a device to get into Joker's mind. And while he's inside Joker's mind, Joker, being Joker, is toying with Batman. And he creates this sort of performance on stage in which he says to Batman that
your need to rescue is so dominant, Batman, that failure is bound to make you cuckoo.
This scene is paradigmatic of the Joker's hold on Batman. We know Batman as someone determined to fight for justice. He cannot and he will not help it. In fact, when we think of Batman's choice, what Batman's choice actually was, what choice defined Batman, we probably think of the initial choice he made after his parents were murdered in that alleyway to pursue a life of fighting for justice. But are we prepared to say that Batman has to make a choice every time he goes to fight Joker? Every single time he sees Joker, Batman is asking himself, should I go fight Joker? I think we intuitively know that's not the case. I think we know that something is pushing Batman to do that. And on some level, he is determined to act that way. Batman must act. Batman must fight. Batman must rescue. And Batman must fight Joker and injustice. You may rightfully suggest, by the way, that Batman might need to fight injustice. He might be required to. He might have turned himself into someone who does need to fight injustice. But that doesn't leave him bereft of choice. Right? Like, that doesn't mean that he never made a choice in his life. And this wouldn't be a good case against free will. You know, what about the choice to become a force against injustice? Back in that awful night for Bruce Wayne. Spoiler alert if you don't know who Batman is. So, but what about the fact that he actually pursued injustice? He pursued this fight against injustice, and instead of, you know, either just becoming a brooding billionaire or partying to, like, sort of take the pain away, you know, what was it that made him do that? You know, that might have been a choice, right? Like, we assume that's a choice. And the final and most important point about this analogy: Batman is not a real non-fictional person. Batman is a character in a story. So how could we possibly extrapolate from Batman to our own complex lives? That's a great question, and we will get to that. I think you'll see that there is a Jewish sage, we'll quote him later, who virtually makes no distinction between characters in a story and humanity in real life, and in the context of free will and determinism. So that's going to be an interesting one to keep in mind, but that's for later. But the goal wasn't really to prove determinism from Batman. It was to use Batman as an analogy to portray the point that we're working with here. And if you want a non-fictional example, I'm sure you know people who are so driven to certain goals that those goals are essentially who they are. Like they just don't have a choice. They need to do something. They need to do this thing which they're so driven by. Like maybe someone is very into painting, right? Like, and they can't help it. They paint everything they see. Their hand and their brush are essentially part of their body in the same way. Like their mind works in a way where an extension of their thought is just a brush stroke. I'm sure we know people like that. And in essence, they're not making a choice every time they pick up the brush or every time they do what they do. They see whatever obstacles are in their way. If they don't have a canvas, they'll get a canvas. If they don't have something that they need, they'll get it. Right? Like, but they're driven. It's almost like they're determined to act that way. They cannot give up. It's their calling. And whatever makeup of environmental and genetic factors led them to behave this way, there is something which strikes us as them having to act this way. And not really making the choice, not really having the choice but to act this way. This is an example of an effect. This behavior is an example of an effect which is caused by some combination of experience, environment, and genetic makeup, and so on and so forth, and what have you. But it would be difficult to call this a choice. And keep in mind that I am not advocating for a lack of free will just yet. But I am advocating for the fact that it may not be as free as we think. So you may find this a little bit more reasonable, but you still might want to say that even if someone's driven for a certain calling, right? Like they had to make a choice at some point in their lives to pursue that calling, right? Like they had to reflect on what they wanted to do in life. They had to choose if that's what they want to pursue. That's a totally reasonable assumption. And we're going to, and you might say that they weren't determined to choose this path, but once a choice is made, certain behaviors are determined, because that's just who a person is. Like that's the emotional tools they've been given. That's how they work with the choices they make. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. And through these videos, I hope to explain in a more nuanced and clear manner exactly what Judaism believes when it comes to free will. So let's take a brief detour. Let's ask ourselves a question. Given this whole scenario, I'm an Orthodox Jew. There are plenty more Orthodox Jews out there. Are we really saying that Orthodox Judaism can allow for determinism in any way whatsoever? I'm not going to answer that question just yet. Mainly because I don't want you to throw this intellectual exercise out. I don't want you to throw out this topic, because even if we come to the conclusion that free will exists, the goal of these videos is to make us more formidable in our knowledge of the modern philosophical questions, of the philosophical questions of the ages and the philosophical questions of the age. That is the goal of virtually every video on this channel, which explains the topic of philosophical debate. So, but that being said, I will point to some verses from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible, and I will point to some statements from the Talmud. And I will at least demonstrate that it's not clear that we believe in a complete freedom of the will, a libertarian freedom of the will. If you're an Orthodox Jew, the verse that might come to mind immediately as someone who believes in the Torah, someone who believes in the Hebrew Bible, is a verse from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. The verse goes as follows. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, if you and your offspring would live, by loving your God, by heeding God's command, and holding fast to God. No Jewish thinker can do away with this verse. It explicitly says to choose life. So the choice, on some level, is being ascribed to you, the person, which seems like an advocacy for free will. But if you know us Jews, we always find a way to finesse the face value of what we see. And I think Jewish thought has grown exponentially because of that ability. Let me draw your attention to some verses from the Talmud. The Talmud in Sotah says, Amar Rish Lakish says, a man only sins if a spirit of insanity enters him. I think that's... I don't know how else to say I don't believe in free will other than that. At least in the way that a libertarian, complete free will advocate might think of it. The second statement from the Talmud I will give to you is from the Talmud in Berachot, 33b. This one might be a lot more familiar to us. Says Rabbi Hanina, everything is in the hands of heaven, save for all of heaven. Everything is in the hands of heaven, save for all of heaven. Of course, this doesn't mean that we have no free will. It's giving us something. It's giving us some sort of free will, or some sort of choice, some sort of ability to choose, capacity to choose. But what exactly does it mean? The quote from Berachot that I just gave you is so prevalent in the work of Jewish sages that it's almost a given assumption of the Jewish worldview. Almost. So now the question becomes, are our actions determined? And the answer, of course, as you would know if you're an Orthodox Jew, a debate. Stay tuned for the next episode, in which we will discuss the view of Jewish sages from the Talmud until modernity, in which we will give a comprehensive overview of the myriad of perspectives that Jewish sages have given on this topic, and explore the panoply of Jewish thought on free will. And in the final episode, we will discuss the modern takes on determinism and free will, and my thoughts on them. And I will additionally do one conclusion episode to summarize my thoughts on the topic. This has been Philosophical Jew. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed these videos, please like, share, and subscribe. I know I'm determined to say that because I want people to watch this. I want to engage with the community who is interested in these topics and who feels as though we need more voices from the Orthodox Jewish world discussing this. So if you really enjoy these videos, please do that. And if you really, really enjoy these videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I will leave the links to it below. One thing to note is that with every video I will release discussing a philosophical topic, I will also release an essay on the same topic on Substack, and if I do end up creating it, and on the Philosophical Jew website. So you can find me on Substack as Philosophical Jew. I will link it down below so that you can read my thoughts on the topic if you feel compelled to do so, and plus they'll be a little bit more precise and they'll have a lot of sources in them, so that if you're wondering where I got my information, you can look that up in the Substack and see that I'm not just making these things up. These are things that were, even some things that may be shocking, these are things that were said by our sages. Some of the things that are my thoughts I will not source because they are my thoughts, but I have done an extensive amount of research. I always try to do that in order to present a formidable account of each side of a philosophical topic. As always, this has been Philosophical Jew. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.